Hey, good morning. It is April 29th, 2020. My name is Tom Donnelly, and I am a pastor, but I am not coming to you as a pastor today. I'm coming to you as Tom Donnelly, a citizen of the United States. And yesterday was a weird day for me, the 28th of April. It was a weird day for me. And I just want to ponder some things with you and I don't know, maybe have a bit of a discussion. So maybe a contrasting story before I make my main point. About 15 years ago, I was for my company, I had a chance to go to China, and I went there a few times. But I went there and for work and stayed at a hotel. And just to relieve stress, I would go downstairs to their athletic area, their gym, get on a treadmill, and I would do some walking or running and exercising there. And they had TVs. They had TVs on the screen, on the walls. And I was watching this international news channel, which was news from Sweden, United States, just all over the world. And as I was watching, the screen went black. And I said, that's weird. I think I had a remote control on my thing. So I tried to shut it off and turn it on again. And I noticed that the light was going on and off, but the screen was black. And I thought something was weird. And I ended up finishing my workout and went back to my hotel room, got dressed and went to work. And then I came down again the next day. Needless to say, I finally figured it out, because I'm sometimes a little bit slow. I finally figured it out that it was censorship, that there were certain things that the government did not want their people to hear. And I was experiencing for the first time in my life true censorship. Like they shut the television off. They shut the signal off and then turned it back on again when that report was done. And I went, oh my gosh. And I remember coming home telling that story and saying how crazy that was. And why that's crazy is I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, at 18 years old, I registered for the Vietnam War. I lived through some of the most dissenting voices of American history as college students all over the country were protesting and sitting in colleges and not doing anything and walking out of colleges and opposing the war. I remember JFK being different than the other politicians. I remember Martin Luther King Jr. peacefully dissenting. I remember a beautiful woman who says, I'm not going to sit in the back of the bus. I remember these things vividly and grew up to understand that we live in a nation where freedom to dissent is critical, because sometimes the dissenting voice is the minority voice and sometimes they're right. And our founding fathers, in the very first amendment to the Constitution, this is what it says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, so freedom of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, so that we should be able to practice whatever religion that we want to practice without their interference. And they should not restrict it. They should also not establish a state religion. But then it says, or abridging the freedom of speech. And here's that whole idea that we have the right to a freedom of speech and also a free press, or the right to peaceably assemble. Civil disobedience, I mean, the protesting. And then ultimately it says, the last phrase, and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. To petition the government for a redress of grievance. That I should have the right to disagree, and the government should protect my right to disagree. And that eventually society will decide. See, we're supposed to have the power, not the government. The government exercises power we give it. They're supposed to administrate it. And the protection of this freedom, this is not the 14th Amendment or the 12th Amendment or it's the first. And it ties into all the others. And so why am I telling you all this? It's because yesterday, in a single moment, YouTube took off a video of some doctors in California. And look, I don't want to get into the issues of who's right, because that's the whole point of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is not we give a person the right to speak if we agree with them. It's we give them a right to speak and we'll decide whether they're right or not. And in a moment, by taking that video off, it took my mind to 15 years ago when I was in China. And I know that YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, I know they're not the government, and I get that. They're private companies or public companies that are doing, I get it. But then my question is this: where do we have the right to speak? Because social media is our platform. It is the modern day place to share our opinions. And I just want to ask the government. I want to ask the president. I want to ask our legislature. I'm petitioning you to protect our right, the redress of grievance, that we have a right to use platforms to share our opinions. Because my question is a couple. What if during the Vietnam War, what if during the civil rights movement, even if it wasn't the government, if a organization was able to say that what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying was misinformation, so must be removed, his voice would have never been heard. If someone would have decided, and many were saying it, that those college kids were radicals and crazy during the Vietnam War and they all should have been shut down and told to get back to school. The fact is, a free press brought that to the papers and brought that to the, just imagine if someone would have said their activity is misinformation. And so they would shut it down. When I was 17 years old, I read Orwell's 1984, and one of the most powerful sections is the doublespeak, using words that say one thing but mean another. And what's misinformation? See, we say the word, but then what does it mean? It's almost like someone's wanting to get permission to shut you off, shut your voice off because you're speaking misinformation. But who decides? If one scientist believes in creation and another one believes in evolution, and they're both scientists and they're both looking at the same data and they're both looking at the same information, Who gets to shut one of them off? In my lifetime, there were people begging that coverage wouldn't take place of Martin Luther King Jr., that coverage wouldn't take place of the civil rights movement, that coverage wouldn't take place of certain things in the Vietnam era. And if somebody would have labeled that stuff misinformation, if somebody would have labeled that stuff as hate speech, how there's another double speak word, hate speech. Could you imagine somebody claiming that the civil rights movement was hate speech and so they never got a voice? Or those college kids were hate speaking? I'm not taking sides on the issues. I just am taking sides on the First Amendment. I don't know where we any longer get a chance to speak. Because if all of a sudden our social media platforms are gone, and all of a sudden they say that our press is no longer free because they're controlled by either a conservative party or a liberal party, and where do we have a voice? And what is the difference between shutting down those two doctors who spoke in California and me being on a treadmill 15 years ago and watching a whole newscast shut off because the communist leaders in China did not want their people to see a video. They didn't want them to have that information. There just seems to be something's changed. Overnight, something's changed. And I think that we've got to do some serious introspection as the people of the United States is what's going on. We're using phrases like hate speech and misinformation as prejudgments of someone's position, and hence giving them permission to censor it. Where does that end? And where does that begin? And who gets to decide? And then ultimately, whatever happened to the civil platform of being able to speak in a free society and being able to say what it is you want to say and allow society to decide whether you're going to get heard? That eventually the radicals and the crazies just didn't get heard, and the people who were saying stuff that was right did get heard, and before you knew it, the minority voice of a Martin Luther King Jr. became a majority voice. And the minority voice of these radical college students became a majority voice and forced us taking our soldiers out of Vietnam. My point is, what would have been declared hate speech or what would have been declared misinformation by somebody back then, thank goodness, they didn't. They didn't have the ability to do it, and hence our society is better for it and has always been better for it when we have the freedom to speak our mind and say what it is we need to say and allow people to decide. But when something can be deemed hate speech or misinformation, and so then someone decides that message never gets to you, my question is, who gets that authority? Who gets that power? It's just something to think about, everybody. I'm 60 years old, and I stayed up last night watching the news, and all I could think about is something has shifted. Something has radically changed. And I don't know that it's for the good. Rather than having the freedom to speak, it sounds like we're being controlled on what we can think. And we're being controlled by what we can say. And again, who has that right? The First Amendment says we have a freedom. And the last thing is that whole thing in the First Amendment about the government. It says that, and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. I'm asking our leadership, from local leadership all the way up to our government and all the way to our president, you got to protect our right to speak. You have to protect those two doctors and their right to speak. Just as we protected Martin Luther King Jr.'s right to speak, and just as we protected those college students who were opposing the Vietnam War, and I could list a whole bunch more since I've been alive, and if I could go back to my parents' day, I could list more. Something has shifted, and I'm asking leaders of our government to stop this shift, because it's going to remove a fundamental freedom, and it's going to change the course of our whole country. All right, that's it. Thank you for now, YouTube, letting me use your streaming platform, a social media platform, to share my thoughts. Have a good day.